Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's so good to see you all here today. My name is Rose Nevill. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Virginia, and I'm the director of the research team on the STAR initiative. I'm very excited to have you all here to listen to this talk on 101, Autism 101, what everybody should know. We do have, this session is fully booked, so if you are a service provider, and if we do run out of chairs and you keep seeing people come in, if you don't mind giving up your seat, because we're trying to prioritize making this event accessible to individuals with autism and their families. I'd greatly appreciate that. So I'm going to be talking for about 40 minutes, and then I'm going to leave about 10 minutes at the end. So because I have some material to cover, I try to get through all the slides so that we have enough time to cover it all and then get to your questions. Okay. So the agenda of this talk, we're going to start off talking about what autism is and how we can explain it to others. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding autism still in our society, and it's sometimes difficult to explain. So I'm going to talk about ways to explain it based off of the diagnostic criteria and how we conceptualize it as a spectrum to hopefully give you some ideas on how you can explain it to other people. I'm going to then talk about how a diagnosis of autism is made and a little bit about the difference between a medical and an educational diagnosis. I'm going to briefly talk about the impact of an autism diagnosis on families, and then talk about tips and ideas that others have shared with me over time that are helpful to them. And then finally, with our knowledge of autism, bearing our knowledge of autism in mind, what that can mean for how we may want to modify how we teach everyday skills to individuals. So as I go through, there's some notepads floating around. Feel free to grab some pieces of paper. You're also more than welcome to take photos of slides. I'm going to show some resources at the end, for example, so you might want to take photos of those if you're interested in them. We're also recording all of these breakout workshops, and we're going to be posting them on the Autism Drive website after today, so you can come back and watch them anytime. Okay, so let's jump in. So, let me ask you a question to start off with. What are some common questions that you have heard about autism? Feel free to shout out.
What are the emotional sides of it?
What are the emotional sides of it? That's a good one.
What causes it?
What causes it? Exactly. Feel free to come. How do you fix it? How do you fix it? Is there a cure? That's another common question.
Does my child have autism?
Does my child have autism? How do I best identify it?
Is there a medication for it?
Is there a medication out there? So there's tons of questions, right? There's tons of ambiguity surrounding autism. There's some seats in the middle here. Feel free to come grab one. So here are some questions that I commonly am asked.
Sorry.
Go ahead. And so I'm going to work on answering some of those questions for you today. And there's also a lot of myths floating out there around autism, and they oftentimes really can affect how people with autism are treated and conceptualized in the community. One myth is they never make eye contact, show affection, or smile. Another one is that there's a normal child waiting to emerge. We know that that's not the case. We don't like to label anybody as normal or abnormal. We just label people as different. Everybody's different. Everybody has a different way of thinking about things. So it's important that we correct people when we say that. They don't speak, but they could if they wanted to. Another big myth, they don't relate well to peers. A lot of people with autism do relate well to peers and adults. They don't want friends. Many people do want friends, but it may just be more challenging to figure out how to navigate the social world, which is, to be honest, a challenging task for myself. So, it's hard for us to figure out social norms. They are manipulative and selfish. That's another big myth that's out there. It's an emotional disorder. We know that that's not the case, and it can be outgrown. We know it's lifelong. So what is autism? We've been talking more and more about autism in society and in the media. You may have seen magazine covers like this, Inside the World. They tend to be very negatively oriented, right? Is there hope for autism? The new inside the hidden world of autism, growing up with autism. But there's still a lot of mystery surrounding it. But my point for this presentation today is that the more we can educate ourselves around autism and educate our communities, the faster we can debunk those myths and increase equal opportunities for the autism community. We've also been seeing a growing number of media depictions of individuals. Who's heard of the Rain Man reference before when you first mentioned autism, right? So a lot of people for the longest time would ask, oh, is that like what Rain Man has? Well, fortunately, we're starting to see more and more media depictions of autism, which is helping increase awareness and acceptance. For example, The Good Doctor, Atypical, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, the movie, Bob's Burger, and I don't actually know what this show's called. It's a detective show, if you recognize it. Thank you, The Bridge. So there's a large number of different media depictions out there, which is helping increase awareness. So how do you explain autism? Also Sesame Street, if you've seen Julia, the newest character has autism. So how do we explain autism? What I recommend is saying that it's complex. It's a complex neurodevelopmental condition, meaning that individuals with autism have a brain that works differently from individuals who do not have autism. We also know that it has an onset early on in life, and it affects individuals across the lifespan. So that's the first step in explaining. We know that there are two core sets of features that we use to identify autism. The first being social differences, and the second being behavioral features. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about what these social differences are and these behavioral features, and I've made effort to describe them as on these slides as I do to families and community members that I've worked with, so that you can maybe generate some ideas or take on some ideas on how to explain it to others. So the first big thing that I always emphasize is that it's a spectrum condition. So we refer to it now as autism spectrum. And the reason we changed it to autism spectrum is because symptoms really range across individuals in severity, in their number. They range across time, so they may appear one way when the person is young, but they may change as the person grows throughout adulthood. And they're also very different across individuals. So who's heard the quote, once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, by Dr. Stephen Shaw, right? So that's a really good quote that I always try to bear with me, because that really does do a good job at explaining it. Along with that, we also tend to see a spectrum of skills in the area of language and cognitive functioning. There was initial misconception that a lot of people with autism had cognitive delay or intellectual disability. That's not actually the case. Only about 30% of individuals with autism also have an intellectual disability diagnosis. The majority of people with autism do not, which is really important to bear in mind. So similar with that theme of spectrum, we see a spectrum or a range in terms of cognitive ability, and we also see co-occurrent with that a spectrum or a wide range in how many language skills a person has, or how confident or independent someone is with spoken language. So on the one end, we may see that people may be unable to use spoken language. They use different forms of communication like apps or picture cards or signs. On the other end, we may see that someone with autism has a very, very large vocabulary. So it really, really does range, which unfortunately makes it harder for us to figure out, right, what are the consistencies. What causes autism? So what have you all heard about causes of autism so far? Immunizations. That one, okay. Any others? Genetics. Heritable, yeah. So there's a lot of misconceptions out there about what causes autism. The first one that was developed or put out there in the community several decades ago was that it was due to bad parenting, and we know we've got tons and tons of evidence that that's not the case. But unfortunately, as psychologists proposed this theory of refrigerator mothers, and this really was had a devastating impact on society, because for many decades, society was blaming autism on their mothers. We know it's not the case. It's unrelated to parenting style. We know it's unrelated to vaccinations and immunizations. And in fact, there was a study, if you heard about this study, that was retracted back in the 90s. It was a study that published false data suggesting a link between vaccinations and autism. That was retracted. That author lost his medical license. And so what we see now is, and there's been randomized controlled trials to test the relationship between autism and vaccines, and they failed to find a relationship. What we do see is that some people are reporting an increase in those autism symptoms right around the time when they receive their vaccinations, the MMR vaccinations. So what we're seeing is more of a correlation, right? Because we tend to see between 18 months and 3 years is when those symptoms really start emerging. That's around the same time you're getting those vaccinations, oftentimes. So we're seeing happening at the same time correlation, but not a causal relationship there. So what we do know about autism is that it has a genetic cause. What specific genes they are at this point, we still don't know yet. So we're still really trying to figure that out. And this is a priority in the research community. A lot of big research organizations like the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee and the National Institute of Health have actually identified finding the genes associated with autism a priority for them. Not only just to find the causal genes, but also genes that can help us figure out what types of people with autism respond best to what types of treatments, as Kevin Pelfrey may have mentioned in his opening address, because we really want to figure out, okay, we've got all these interventions out there, what works best for whom? Because that would be a very helpful next step intervention. Many current theories also suggest that it's an interaction between genes and the environment. So some people may carry a genetic predisposition that is then activated by certain events that happen in the environment. What those are yet, we don't know. For some time we thought it was associated with prenatal exposure to Prozac and other antidepressants. We found that that isn't the case. We were able to disprove that. So we're still trying to figure out what those causes are. So what does it look like when you're explaining autism to a friend, a family member, a care provider for your child? They're oftentimes going to ask you, what does it look like? What should I be looking for? What may be a symptom of that versus their personality versus potentially different or bad behavior. So what it looks like, we see difficulties and sometimes challenges in the social back and forth. And this can look like having a tough time figuring out how to engage in a back and forth conversation. This may be more tricky at times. And therefore individuals may benefit from some support or coaching in learning this skill. It may be challenging to figure out how to share interests, affect, emotions with others. So if I'm excited about something, indicating or communicating to somebody else that I am excited and being able to make that person be excited, sharing those emotions, having that social interchange of emotions, interests. Initiating and responding to social overtures, so someone walking up to you, starting a conversation, saying hello. This may be an area that may be challenging to some folks. We also see that it can be challenging to integrate all of the different aspects of nonverbal communication with verbal communication. So when you think, I love this graphic here to explain, because when you're thinking about a social interaction, someone comes up, they make eye contact, they make gesture, they may communicate, they may have body language. There's so many different elements of that social interchange, right? For individuals with autism, they are able to recognize each of those individually, but it may be at times more challenging to figure out how to integrate all of those at the same time. And when you think about how much of communication is nonverbal, I think they say about 70% of communication is nonverbal. That makes it really challenging sometimes to figure out, okay, what is the tone of this conversation? How should I be behaving? So many times people with autism benefit from supports in this area as well. We may see differences in how relationships are understood, developed, and maintained over time. So one area that may be more challenging is figuring out how to change behavior to match social situations, how to make and keep friends. being creative, having creative thought and engaging in creative play while in early childhood may be an area that could be more challenging. And then, so that was the overview of what we may see social communication skills being like. Remember, that was that first sort of core domain that we're looking for, social communication. Now I'm going to move into the restricted and repetitive behavior. That's how we conceptualize or refer to that second part of key features that we're looking for when we make a diagnosis. So the first example of this may be very specific or repetitive movements, use of objects, or speech. And again, there's multiple examples here because it can range from individual to individual in how these are demonstrated. So we may see, especially in earlier childhood, repetitive movements. Some very common examples might be hand flapping or rocking or pacing or bouncing repeatedly. We may see repetitive actions with objects. So it can include, fidgeting repetitively with the same thing. It can include dropping an object over and over again, insisting on putting an object inside a certain box or inside a container over and over. With regard to repetitive speech, it can look like repeating what has been heard recently or a long time over and over again. So for example, and this is what we refer to as echolalia. So for example, I once worked with a boy who would repeat the bus number that he would be getting on at the end of the day, beginning of the day. So he would repeat bus 407, bus 407, and he'd say that repeatedly. That's something he heard a long time ago at the beginning of the day, or maybe some time ago, but it's something that he was doing to help, I think, soothe himself and comfort himself because he was remembering, okay, this is where I'm going next today. So you may see some of that repetitive speech. You may also see some repeating of unusual phrases. So phrases that may not make a whole lot of sense, but it does make sense to them, and it makes sense based on how they're interpreting the world. So they may have made up some phrases, or they may have heard some phrases on TV that they combined with other examples of phrases and merge them together, and then may repeat those over and over. We also look for very specific interests in objects, topics that may be hard to let go. And we'll talk in a second about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So examples can be a certain specific toy, oftentimes in boys, not always, but it's more common that we see strong interest in motorized items or items that have mechanical components to it, because it's really interesting to see how those work together, how all of the pieces to fit together, and that is a big interest. Specific topics. My uncle has autism, and he has had a lifelong interest in D-Day landings in World War II. This is not a D-Day picture, but that's something he really likes to talk about, and he's read hundreds and hundreds of books of the topic, and he knows all about it. Thomas, the tank engine, a wide range of different topics or objects may be a focus of interest. So, these strong interests, are they a strength or a limitation? So thinking about that, thinking about if you know someone with autism or if you have autism, is it a strength or a limitation? Oftentimes society has referred to it or referenced it as a limitation. But what we really need to start thinking about how these interests can be turned into strengths, because for many people, they are strengths. For many people, this is what can lead into a career path, right? Or a hobby. It can lead into a way that they can help others. Steve Jobs, if you've seen the Netflix documentary about Steve Jobs that was recently released, you can see in the first episode references to some really specific interests that he had, and look at where he is today. The creator of Pokemon was really interested in anime and cartoons growing up. Look at where he is now. Temple Grandin is really interested in an advocate who has autism, has a lot of interest in cattle and how we can take care of cattle and livestock safely, and look at where she is now. She's now a STEAM faculty member, and in animal science. So what we what I think a lot of the society does is focus on the negatives, so what we may see as tantrums, especially in younger children when they're separated from that interest, which can make it challenging, right? But what we can do is also use those interests as a way to motivate people, motivate them to learn, motivate them so that we can teach positive skills, and then think long-term about how we can continue to work with those interests to build them into strengths. So continuing on that behavioral feature train, we also may see very minimal or really strong interest in specific sensations, and you may also see very strong or intense interest in sensory aspects of the world. So examples of this can include having a really, really high pain and temperature tolerance, or on the converse, very low pain, very high pain sensitivity. You may see extreme dislike of textures, sounds, and when coming into contact with that, that can be extremely distressing. Excessively smelling or touching objects, that's what we're referring to as looking for that sensory input from the world. So for someone who has this characteristic, it's comforting to contact those sensory aspects of the world. It feels good, smelling or touching. So thinking about when we're thinking about, okay, is this something that is a problematic behavior? Or think about the fact that this maybe is likely bringing comfort to that person. And it might be something that you want to work with to figure out, okay, how can I best support this so that it can happen at times when it's appropriate and prevent it from happening when times it's inappropriate. Visual fascination with light and movement, these are also examples of some sensory interests. We tend to look for a need for consistency and sameness. There's a lot of comfort in the consistency of routine and sameness. So it may be that we see extreme distress in response to changes. So one example would be some kids I've worked with end up getting very agitated when they go a different way to school or take a different route in the car because they're used to taking a specific different route. They may also be used to getting a specific snack or food item at a specific time of the week, and not having access to that routine can be very distressing. Or insisting on sameness with objects, so it can include sorting things a specific way, lining things up in a certain way, organizing things in a certain way, and not being able to do that can be challenging and frustrating. Difficulties with transitions can be another piece of the puzzle there. And so what we're referring to here is transitioning from face to face, from classroom to classroom, or transitioning from one activity to the next throughout the day. That can be at times difficult for the individual to cope with. So that's how we can describe it to friends, family members, community members, and thinking about if you know people on the spectrum who have demonstrated examples of this, you can use these examples to explain to them, okay, these are behaviors or areas of this individual that may need support in the classroom, in the community, in the family, etc. So how do we diagnose autism? Has anyone been through the diagnostic process before? Some familiarity with it? So there are a number of tools that are out there now that can be used to screen for autism. If you currently have concerns that a child may have autism, or if you're interested in seeing it, these first two links are free online, so you can use these links to complete screeners, and those screeners can tell you whether you may be someone who would benefit from further evaluation for autism or not. The social communication questionnaire is another example of a tool that if you do go for an evaluation, you would be handed to complete before your appointment. And then there's also more general developmental screens called the Ages and Stages questionnaire. That's one commonly used tool that measures for not just autism, but more so other developmental conditions. So after that point, there's various ways that you can get a diagnosis of autism. It may be that you are evaluated by a psychologist. If you're a child, it may be that you're evaluated by a specialist in pediatrics, so a pediatrician, a nurse practitioner, someone who has expertise in childhood medicine. These tend to be folks who are qualified to make a diagnosis. Or you may go see an interdisciplinary team, which consists of a combination of maybe a speech pathologist, a psychologist, a doctor, maybe an audiologist to check hearing. And so that's what we call an interdisciplinary team. Ideally, we're hoping to get the world to a point where everybody has access to an interdisciplinary team for an assessment. Right now across Virginia, there are a couple sites like UVA, VCU, Inova, Virginia Tech, that do provide access to interdisciplinary teams. But unfortunately, the wait list for these services can be long. So in the meantime, it's beneficial to seek a diagnosis from a pediatrician or an internist if you're an adult. And so when you get that health and medical evaluation, you may see that primary care doctors or pediatric specialists will assess and just make a diagnosis based on what you report and watching the child. Others may go more in depth by conducting a psychological assessment. And these are generally the gold standard tools that are out there right now that can be used to inform a diagnosis. The Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule is a play-based, semi-structured assessment where an examiner will sit down with someone at a table or on the floor if they're a young child, talk to them, do some activities, and see what happens. The Autism Diagnostic Interview Revised is an interview with either the individual or a caregiver, and then the Childhood Autism Rating Scale is something that's completed based off of observation as well.
Is there a certain age that the last one is done, the Childhood Autism Rating Scale? Is that a certain age?
18 to 22.
18 to 22, okay, got it.
So, educational versus medical diagnoses. What's important to bear in mind is that these are not the same. A medical diagnosis is what you need to get a diagnosis added to someone's medical record, and it's necessary for in-home or center-based supports, and it's also necessary for insurance to qualify you, for you to be qualified under your insurance plan for ABA therapy and other types of services. Educational evaluations do not mean, or an educational diagnosis doesn't mean that you're going to be eligible for autism services under your insurance plan. So it's really important, if you do get an educational diagnosis and you are interested in some in-home therapies, you then take that information to your child's doctor so you can get that medical diagnosis as well. Educational evaluations are important for getting that category of eligibility in the school system. And so educational diagnoses are primarily made to say, this is someone who would benefit from special education services at school. And how they do that is by determining if these social differences and behavioral differences are causing any type of interference in their learning in the general education classroom. If they are, then an educational evaluation makes sense. If someone with autism is able to successfully learn within the classroom, then it may be that they may have a greater challenge qualifying for an educational evaluation. If you have more questions about that, I recommend you go to the educational workshop that's next, and you can see where that is on your schedules. So effects on the family. So parents tend to report high amount of stress. I'm going to start off with negative slides, and then I'm going to go into positive again, just to give you a heads up. So parents of individuals with autism tend to report very high levels of stress. They report challenges addressing the needs of their children, particularly because of all of the false information that's out there about autism, right? It makes it hard to figure out what's the right decision for my child and my family. They oftentimes have to go through a relearning process, not just on how to best support their child, thank you, but how to best work with each other, because it's going to be a family team process to figure out how to best make time for each other while also trying to make their child's needs met. It can result in feelings of isolation and frustration in the parenting experience, because oftentimes parents of an individual with autism may not know another parent of an individual with autism, and the parenting experiences that you're experiencing may be somewhat unique. So it can result in feelings of isolation and frustration along those lines. We also see differences in coping styles between mothers and fathers. There's been tons of research over time looking at coping in mothers. A lot of people have been forgetting about dads, right? But dads are important too. Research shows that dads are stressed out too. We don't need research to say that dads are stressed out, right? Any parent of any child out there is stressed out. So coping styles tend to differ, and so it's important that we provide coping supports and mental health supports to parents as well. Here's another useful link. Siblings tend to report that they're embarrassed around peers because they're behaving a little bit differently. They may experience jealousy towards their sibling because they're getting more attention than them, which can be challenging. They may be frustrated about the difficulties their sibling is experiencing. If their sibling displays aggressive behavior, they may be a target of that, so then it benefits that sibling early on to teach them some intervention skills. But they also oftentimes report being concerned about the safety and well-being and quality of life of their sibling. My dad is a sibling, and I'm working with him right now to figure out where my uncle is going to live after my grandmother passes away. She's 89. So we're very concerned about that, and we want to make sure that my uncle has a good quality life. He can live with who he wants to live with after she goes, because that's what he deserves, that's what everybody deserves. So what helps? Here's the positive side. So building and using a social support system. So it may be hard to find other families in your community who also have someone in their family who's affected by autism. But the good thing is that there's a growing number of groups online where you can get on, connect with other parents, Facebook groups, blogs, and it's a good way to chat and connect with each other, because you'd be surprised how helpful it is to just share your parenting experiences with each other. Look at everybody's name tags. We've put your towns where you're from on there. So if you, as you go around, try to find people from your town so you can connect with each other. Increasing awareness is what we're always trying to do, because the faster we can increase societal awareness of autism, the faster we can educate society, the faster we can increase services and supports, acknowledgement and equal opportunities for people with autism. It's really important that we don't shy away from talking about it. We don't shy away from explaining it to everybody, because through awareness and action, we can increase opportunities for inclusion. Who's heard of mindfulness? So it sounds confusing, I think, but there's actually a lot of research to show that mindfulness-based coping is really helpful for parents of individuals with autism and other developmental conditions. Don't be afraid to go to counseling just to have someone to chat to. Mindfulness-based coping, there are tons of books out there, are really helpful as well. Structure and routine is particularly helpful, and building that in throughout your day to support your family member with autism can be really helpful and really important. Establishing some meaning in adversity that you may come across, whether it be related to community, accessing services, being understood. It's been helpful for many folks that I've talked to identify some meaning, whether that be, okay, because of this, I'm going to get involved in an action group, or I'm going to start a community focus group, or I'm going to make it a goal to educate others. Doing that has been helpful for people to cope. Affirming strengths and maintaining a positive view. So it's easy for us to think about negatives and what someone cannot do, but it's really more important to think about what someone can do and focus on those, because it's through doing that that we can help continue to build positive growth. Being cognizant of the time. I'm going to skip ahead. We've got these teaching skills in everyday life. I'm going to skip ahead because you've got the ABA workshop you can go to, and you've also got evidence-based intervention that I'm going to be giving next, that is going to talk more about teaching everyday skills. So check those out if you're interested in this. I wanted to share, more importantly, these resources with you. So feel free to take photos. Again, these presentations are going to be recorded and put online. Here are some useful websites with information about autism. I want to take a picture. And then, wait, tends to go down, we've got another slide. Here's some books that I really like. These are geared for parents. Visual supports for people with autism, Steps to Independence is really, really nice way of building independent living skills. And then this book was written by folks over at the UC Davis Mind Institute, which is a really great autism center out on the West Coast. So here are some books as well.